Hello and welcome to Auth0 Online Meetup number 8. So today we're going to be talking about primarily SAML 2.0, and we have an excellent guest speaker with us today. His name is Rory Braybrook, and he is coming to us from New Zealand. So all the way from Auckland, New Zealand. And we are very grateful to have him. Rory is a New Zealand Microsoft identity architect and is a Microsoft partner technology solutions professional. He mainly covers Azure Active Directory, B2C, ADFS, and sometimes Auth0 and Identity Server as well. And Rory is also the NordShore.net user group co-admin. So if we have any New Zealand listeners, I would definitely recommend you reach out to Rory and attend his meetups in person. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Rory to do his presentation. Just a quick disclaimer that this meetup is being recorded and we are going to send the recording right afterwards. And the last piece of housekeeping is that if you guys do have any questions, please submit them and we will get to them as soon as Rory's presentation is over. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to Rory, and thank you guys for coming.
Okay, well, hi everybody. So yeah, it's 9 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday in Auckland, and we've got a beautiful sunny day, about 19 degrees, so it's just kind of spring weather. If you're wondering about my accent, I come from Malawi, which is in Central Africa. So it's north of Zimbabwe and south of Tanzania and west of Mozambique. As Ado said, I'm a Microsoft identity architect, so I'm pretty much in the Microsoft space, although I do add in Auth0 sometimes where it can do things that the Microsoft stack can't. I also do quite a lot with Identity Server. If you don't know what Identity Server is, it's an open source C# IDP written by Dominic Bauer and Brock Allen, who are both Microsoft MVPs. And because it's open source, you can pretty much make it do anything you want. And I quite often plug it in the middle when I need to do specialized stuff. Okay, so I live, as Ado mentioned, I live in Auckland. And this is my local beach. This is Long Bay in Auckland. It's about 5 minutes walk from where I live. And it's an awesome place to go on a Friday night to get some takeaway fish and chips and just sit there and just relax after a pretty hectic week. Okay, so we're here to talk about SAML. So there's no way that I can cover a great in-depth deep dive into SAML in the time that I've got. So I'm really, this is a 10,000 foot view, but hopefully it gives you a bit of an insight into SAML and kind of things you can do with it. And the reason that I proposed SAML to Ado is because, you know, there's just so much OpenID Connect out there that people forget that at the back, you know, server to server and software as a service and federation and stuff, a lot of that is using SAML. So we'll talk about a little about the history. We'll talk about the protocols, bindings, and profiles in SAML. We'll look at some stacks. We'll talk about metadata and the name ID. I'll show you a demo, and then we'll look at the packets and the payload. We'll talk about IDP-initiated, which is the other flow to SP-initiated. Some tips on troubleshooting, and then the references. So we go back to March 2005. There was a collaboration between Oasis and the Liberty Alliance, and the SAML 2 spec came out. By 2008, it was in common use, but you can see there that it's very much an enterprise in use. On the other side of the fence, we had Microsoft and IBM developing a protocol called WS Federation, which is one of the WS star protocols. So there's WS Trust, WS Security, etc. And it was typically used to connect Microsoft components together. So SharePoint, CRM Dynamics, Office 365, ADFS, ACS, etc. These days, Microsoft is also going down the OpenID Connect route, and you'll hear in the documentation they refer to that as moving to modern Auth. But that was back in the days when Microsoft was, you know, kind of this proprietary, closed, evil empire system. People didn't want to use proprietary standards, so The open source world went with Java, and with Java, they went with SAML. And kind of one of the first IDPs that came out was Shibboleth. It's free, it's open source, it's built on a Java library called OpenSAML, and it's used extensively by academia. I've done work in New Zealand with some of the universities. They use it. Universities connect to each other and share resources and things like that. There's a whole debate about whether SAML's suited for mobile applications because it's based on browser redirects versus REST. It's got a heavy XML payload versus a nice slim JSON one. The cryptographic requirements are heavier and so on and so forth. But my personal opinion is that SAML is really good for enterprise and federation, not so good for mobile or native or desktop or something like that. So it's still one of the big players for federation and Salesforce, Workday, ServiceNow, all those big software as a service systems all use SAML. So if you don't know what federation is, it's basically if you've got two companies, Contoso and Fabricam, and the Contoso people want to use a Fabricam application. In the good old days, the Fabricam people would put Contoso people into their AD so they could authenticate. That's probably not a good thing from security. It's an even worse thing when someone in Contoso leaves, but they don't tell Fabricam. So although they don't work for Contoso, they've still got access. So federation is basically you put an IDP on each side, you hook them up, you pass metadata backwards and forwards. When the Contoso person goes to Fabricam, they see a screen called the Home Realm Discovery screen, and it says, do you want to authenticate with Contoso or with Fabricam? You say Contoso, it takes you back to the Contoso AD. You authenticate with your Contoso credentials and get into the application. But the key point is that your Contoso credentials don't cross the boundary. They stay inside the Contoso kind of space. There is, in terms of federation, WS Federation and SAML are the two big players. There is now a draft spec, which is for OpenID Connect Federation. No one that I'm aware of has implemented it. I will share these slides with Addo afterwards, and there's a whole lot of references at the back that you can have a look at. So at the moment, OpenID Connect, I wouldn't consider as a federation protocol. All right, so we have protocols, bindings, and profiles, or the different components of the SAML specification. Now, the SAML world uses assertions or attributes instead of what Microsoft called claims. So the protocols are basically a description of each XML element in the payload, how they're packaged, what you need, what they mean, how they interact, how you produce them, and how you consume them. The bindings are basically how you map that onto the standard messaging and communications protocols. And the profiles are essentially use cases, which basically says this is a use case for a particular set of assertions, protocols, and bindings. So bindings are HTTP redirect, which basically puts the parameters in the URL. So it's essentially a GET. We do post binding, which basically puts them into a form. And we've got artifact binding, which uses artifact resolution, and it uses SOAP in the background. The profiles, the kind of main ones, you've got the web browser protocol. That's by far the most common. That's the one you use if you want to go to Salesforce or Workday or whatever. Then we've got artifact resolution. So artifact resolution, basically when you authenticate, you don't get the token back, you get an artifact, which is essentially a GUID. You then pass the GUID back to the IDP using a back channel, which is SOAP, and then on SOAP, you get the token. So it's a two-stage flow. I've done hundreds of SAML integrations, and I've only ever found one customer that uses artifact resolution, so it's not very common. Enhanced client or proxy profile is SAML's attempt for this mobile native world, although when they brought that out, it was primarily aimed at desktop. It is a way of doing it. The problem is that I don't know of many IDPs that actually implement that profile. I know for a fact that ADFS doesn't because I went and investigated that. So although it's a way of doing it, and you'll see people on Stack Overflow saying, hey, you could use this, it's not actually implemented in many places. And we've got the single logout profile. So that's the opposite of the single sign-on. So if you are signed on to 5 applications. When you log out of one, you log out of all of them. Now that's maybe what you want, and maybe that's not what you want. And you can go and look on the internet. There's a whole lot of debate about how this profile should be handled, with the kind of result almost that Shibboleth just doesn't support it. It just said, you know, no one can decide how this thing should work, so we're just not going to do it. All right, so we've got the identity provider, we've got the service provider. The service provider is the application. In the WS Federation world, the service provider would be called a relying party. So your typical use case is an application, which is the service provider, going to an IDP, and the IDP could be Auth0 or ADFS or Azure AD or Identity Server or any of the others, using SAML 2. But we have another one, which is quite common, where we have the application, for example, going to Auth0, and in that part of the flow, Auth0 is acting as the IDP. But actually, we don't want to authenticate with Auth0. We want to authenticate with another IDP. So in that part of the flow, on the right-hand side, Auth0 is actually the SP to another IDP. So the same security token system can be an IDP and an SP. So Auth0 does that, ADFS does that. Azure AD doesn't do that because Azure AD can only be an IDP. And I see a lot of questions on Stack Overflow about that flow, because people are really confused between where's the service provider and where's the IDP. And the name for this kind of pass-through, where you're just passing through to somewhere else, in the literature they call it a relaying STS security token system, which is an IDP acting as a pass-through. Now, SAML requires endpoints, it requires certificates, it requires whether you sign stuff, whether you encrypt stuff. And instead of doing everything manually, they came up with a concept of metadata. So metadata is basically a huge XML document that contains the certificates, that contains the endpoints, that shows you the flows and the claims and everything. So what you do is typically the two sides swap metadata, and then they don't have to worry about all the bits and pieces. So if we go and look at, so this is an example of Auth0's metadata. You can see that in this particular one, it's an IDP descriptor. So this is acting as an IDP. There is the certificate in there. We've got the endpoint. So we've got the single logout service. We've got the name ID formats over here, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We've got the endpoints for single sign-on, and we've got some of the attributes that it supports. Okay. So in metadata can be signed. In this case, this metadata isn't signed. If you look at ADFS, which is a little bit more involved, what we've got is we've got some role descriptors, because ADFS does WS Federation, so I'm not going to bother about that. But we can see here that the metadata is signed. This is the signature value, and this is the certificate that we used. And so if you try and change the metadata, if you try and hack it to point to your endpoint, it won't be accepted by the IDP. So in the ADFS world, you can see we've now got an SP descriptor, because the SP descriptor is the other half of that IDP SP1. And again, you've got a certificate, and you can see that this certificate is used for encryption. And then we've got another certificate, and this certificate is used for signing. Then we've got the same kind of thing, the single logout service, the name ID, the endpoints, and then we've got the same thing for the IDP descriptor. So the metadata can be quite big, because you can add in claims and things like that. You see on the IDP side, there's a whole list of the types of claims that it is prepared to accept. Okay. Now, in SAML, the name ID is absolutely key. That is very much the primary key between two systems. So if you've got your system talking to Salesforce, in your system, you are an email address. In Salesforce, you might be something else. There needs to be a common key between the two. So when you go to Salesforce, it knows exactly who you are. And the attribute that we use for name ID, which could be email or UPN or whatever, is what we call the name ID. Name ID has different formats, so you can have an email address format, which means it looks like an email address. And then there's two other formats, there's persistent and transient. The idea of those is that you don't actually use something that identifies you, you use something like a GUID. Persistent means that every time you log in, you get the same GUID. Transient means every time you log in, you get a different GUID. There's also one called unspecified, which means it's up to the IDP and the SP to negotiate as to how to actually recognize that. But the number one thing in a SAML federation is getting the name ID right. Otherwise, you'll go to Salesforce and say, sorry, although you can authenticate, I don't know who you are. I don't know if you've got a license. Now, in my world, which is the Microsoft world, in the C# world, in terms of the SAML stacks, we have a few. So Microsoft does not have a SAML stack. There was a SAML stack, which was kind of came out as part of Windows Identity Foundation, or WIF. It sat around for a while. It never got any bugs fixed. And then one day it just disappeared. So at the moment, we've got component space, which does IDP and SP, it's .NET and .NET Core. A company called Rock Solid Knowledge, which is IDP and SP only on .NET Core. And Sustainsis, which is open source. It's only does the SP, and it's .NET and .NET Core. And all of these can be used with Identity Server. Now, I see tons of questions on Stack Overflow about, my boss says I have to authenticate with a SAML stack. So I have a blog. This is my blog, The New Control Plane. It's up on Medium. And I answered this question so many times that I decided I would actually write a blog post about it. So this is a blog post which basically says in the C# world, there's a SAML stack from one login. There's Sustainsis, which is the one I've told you about. You can go through it. There's a ton of implementations in the Java world. The OpenSAML that we spoke about with Shibboleth. We've got Spring Security, which is huge. It's an open source plugin and it does SAML. PHP, there's Simple SAML PHP, which I've used for quite a few customers. And of course, in the Node world, you've got Passport. So Passport is the big player there. And so it's just, as I find stacks, I keep adding to this article. So that was fine. What I did is I'd written this article and people at least had somewhere to go and look. There was some documentation. They could do a bit of research. But then the question that started to come across on Stack Overflow was, hey, I've looked at this and I've kind of got a stack and I think this is the one I'm going to use. But, I can't actually figure out how to connect it. So I started another series inside my blog, which I called the Connecting series. And this basically goes through all the stacks that I use. So there's an ADFS. We can use this custom SAML connection for Azure. We can use Rock Solid Knowledge. We can use Sustainsis. So I kind of go through all the ones that I play with. And I basically say, this is a how-to of how you connect this to this using this stack. And you can go and read them. And here is one over here, which is the one that I'm just going to demo to you, which is using Auth0 and this is Sustainsis SAML for .NET Core. Okay, so we've done that. All right, and so that's the connecting series. So if we go and look at the demo, so Sustainsis basically has just blow that up for you. This is the Sustainsis project on GitHub. You can go and download the whole project. It has a little DLL that you plug into your project, and it's got some samples. So this is the .NET Core sample. So what you do is you provide the entity ID, and that's in the metadata. That's what identifies the SAML stack, because this uses Owen, and Owen allows you to have multiple SAML stacks, so it has to know which connection to match. And it also allows you to specify metadata. So Sustainsis has this really neat feature that you just tell where the metadata is, and it works out the endpoints, and it works out the certificates, and it works all that stuff out, and you don't have to go and download it from Auth0 and copy it across into the server and things like that. So that's a really nice feature, and it makes things so much easier. And that literally is what you're looking at there is the configuration that you need, and that's pretty much it. So if we go to the Auth0 side, so we've got applications. We've got, this is my Sustainsis application. This is my Auth0 tenant. So we go down to the bottom where we've got show advanced settings. And over here, we have endpoints and we have certificates. So the certificates, we don't really need to worry about because Sustainsus gets from the metadata. And the endpoints you'll see here is the SAML metadata endpoint. So we take that and we put it into the Sustainsus project, and that's how the two hook together. And over here, as I say, this is all written up in that blog, so you can go and read it. In the add-ons, we have the SAML2 web app. That is the assertion consumer service of the Sustainsus client, and you can set up a whole lot of options here inside the JSON. Now, Auth0 by default uses SHA-1, and Sustainsus by default uses SHA-256 to sign. So it's incompatible, they won't talk, so we tell Auth0, look, don't use SHA-1, use SHA-256, and there are the settings that you use for that. So that's pretty much all you need to do. You connect it up. So if I go over here, now over here I've got a little thing which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is going to show me the traffic. So if I now go over here to, have we lost something? Yeah. How do I get to the, I need to get the login button, which is behind this screen. Can I minimize it?
Which login button?
So this application's got a login button, but I've got the go to webinar panel showing here. Can I move it or?
Oh yeah, you should be able to move it.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, that's good. Sorry about that.
No
Right,
worries.
so there's the login. There's the login button. So this is actually identity server. So here we have another button, which is going to take us off to Auth0 because that's how we hooked it up. So we hook it up, SAML2, and I've already logged in. It says, hey, you've logged in as this dude. And off I go. So it goes to Auth0, SAML, and with a bit of luck, yes, it says there you are, you're logged in. So if I go back to this little tool over here, what we'll see here is, what it does is it goes through the traffic, and if it's SAML traffic, so I just need to move this thing again. If it's SAML traffic, it puts a little orange button there. If it's WS-Fed traffic, it puts a little blue button. So if you look at that SAML, and you can see there's a little SAML tab here. Let me just blow that up for you. So this is the authn request in SAML. So this is the equivalent of the authorized endpoint in OpenID Connect. So we're sending an authn request. We've got some IDs. We've got when it was issued. This is my Auth0 tenant. This is where I'm coming from. I can sign this, so there'd be a whole signature here. There's a whole lot of other things you can do. For the purpose of me hooking it all up, I decided to keep it really simple. So this is kind of probably the simplest authn request that you can see. Now, if I go to this one, we will see the SAML response, which is over here. Now, it is quite big, so it's easier to look at that over here. So this is the actual SAML response. So you can see straight away, this is a lot bigger than your JOT token. And there's a lot more stuff in here. And this, again, is probably only half of what you could have in here. So you've got the issuer, you've got the status code, which is a status of success. You've got, there's the success, so yeah, it worked. You've got versions, you've got signatures, we signed it. We've got the signature value using the certificate. We have the name ID. So here we've decided that the format is unspecified. So this is my user in Auth0, and we can map this on the other side, or we can use claims rules in ADFS to take this and convert it into an email or a UPN or something. This here tells you how long the SAML token is valid for. This is the audience restriction. So this is only for the client inside Sustainsus. And then we have a whole lot of claims. So we have email address, so that's the email address, and the name, that's the name, and so on. So you can see there's a whole lot of claims in this kind of assertion format. So that is a lot bigger, and there's a whole lot of stuff that isn't in this. It can get quite complicated, but you can see that the protocol is way more complicated than OpenID Connect. And this is one of the reasons, these kind of huge tokens, that I don't really think it's suited for mobile, because it can be a lot bigger than this. Right, so that's that. So we've done that. Now, in terms of how you actually see the payloads, inside Fiddler, there is a text wizard. And in text wizard, there's an option that will decode and encode SAML for you. Auth0 has got a tool called SAML2.io, which I can show you, which is over here. So this is, you basically plug it in here and it decodes it over here, and you can prettify it and expand and stuff. And this was written 4 years ago, because that's when the token was made. And the person that logged on was Matthias. So some of you will recognize that name. So that's the Auth0 tool. There's one for ADFS help. I've showed you the Firefox SAML tracer, which I find invaluable, because you can actually see the traffic and you can see the SAML, and it decodes it for you. There's equivalent one for Chrome. That doesn't show you the traffic, it just decodes the SAML for you, but it is very useful. There's an online tool. There's quite a lot of online tools, but that's an example of one. And then this is one from AWS, which is basically, if you're using SAML with ADFS, how to view it, which kind of has much the same content as what I've got here. All right, so we've talked about SP-initiated. So SP-initiated, you saw in the demo, we started with an application, we went to the IDP, we authenticated on the IDP, and we went back to the application. Now, SAML has this weird kind of reverse one called IDP-initiated, which no other federation protocol has. And the idea of IDP-initiated is that you start on the IDP. So this is an example from ADFS. So what you do is you first sign into ADFS, and then there's a drop-down down here. And this shows you all the SAML applications that ADFS is aware of. And then you pick the one you want to, and it goes to the application. So from the application side, the application gets an auth-in response without ever having sent an auth-in request. So it's kind of like an asynchronous response. The auth-in response that you get from SP-initiated and IDP-initiated is exactly the same. So you're getting the same token back, but it's kind of async. You just have to be prepared to get the token at any time. So, and some SAML stacks don't implement that, and so they don't support IDP-initiated. It's quite useful if, and I'll show an example now, where you want the users to have a little panel where they can select where they want to go to, and IDP-initiated is ideal for that kind of flow. Because, you know, in the corporate world, when you come to work, you log in from your laptop, and then you use integrated Windows Auth, which goes through ADFS or whatever, and then when you click the buttons, you're already logged in. This is an example of the Auth0, sorry, the Azure AD one, of how you configure it. So you can see this basic SAML, you configure user attributes, you set up the signing certificates, and this part at the bottom here is the instructions that you have to give to the other party for them to configure it. And it's got quite a little neat test button down here, which Auth0 is also, you can do little tests with it. So it's all pretty much the same. Now, this is the My Apps panel in Azure AD. So you can customize this panel for different users. And so different users and different groups see different panels. But you can see the SAML app that I've just been showing you is that little button down here. And when you click that button, that will do IDP-initiated to the application. So all the SAML apps in this panel would use IDP-initiated. So once you're logged in, you just click the buttons and go to all the applications that you want to. So that is quite a nice use case in that scenario. Auth0 also supports IDP-initiated. In the identity provider, you can go and set it up there. So it's one that Auth0 supports as well. Now, I get a lot of questions and problems where I have a service provider that insists on encrypting its tokens, for example, and I have an IDP that does not have the capacity or the capability to unencrypt them. So what you have there is an incompatibility. They are not going to talk to each other. And what I do is I bridge them. So I use something like ADFS or Auth0, where it has that IDP-SP model, that RSTS flow. And on the side, talking to the relying party, to the application, to the service provider, the IDP is set up to allow encryption. So from the service provider to the IDP, it is encrypted. On the other side, from the IDP to your destination, it is unencrypted. So that way we can bridge two incompatible implementations by putting a bridge in the middle. And I do quite a lot of that because it's not only encryption, it could be claims. So in ADFS, and you can use claims rules. In Auth0, you can use those rules. So you can do a bit of manipulation. You can combine claims. You can kind of if then else type of things. And so the claims coming from the service provider may not be exactly the same claims sent off to the, your endpoint, like Salesforce or whatever. So that is a really useful tip, because I do that quite a lot. Because the one side will say our stack doesn't support encryption, and the other side says, look, our security department mandates encryption, and we don't even get a choice about it. In terms of troubleshooting SAML, well, you saw that status that said success. In SAML, if it doesn't work, it says responder, and that is all it says. And that is really useful information. It simply says it didn't work. In the ADFS world, you can go and look in the event log, and sometimes there's clues, sometimes there's not. That's where you use those tools like the Firefox SAML tracer, where you go and look at the traffic and look at the payloads and look at things like name IDs and so on and so forth. Certificates is a big one. The certificates have to be trusted sometimes. They sometimes need to be in the certificate store. They need the revocation validation chain to be complete sometimes, obviously not expired, and you need to exchange the certificates, but sometimes you exchange the wrong certificates. Name ID, if you don't get the name ID right, it won't work. It needs to be the correct type. It's no good passing email if the other one's expecting a UPN, and it needs to be the right format. Some applications need certain assertions. They need a given name, or they need a department, or they need a postcode or something. So you have to kind of talk to both sides and see what they require. SHA-1 and SHA-256 is a big one because people, like I showed you with the Auth0 example, the one's 256 and the one's SHA-1. Signatures, there's an online tool, and there's quite a few of them, but there's one that I use that checks them. And some of the SAML stacks that I showed you, for example, component space, come with a set of utilities. So there's a little command line utility where you basically say, here's the token, here's the certificate, and it'll go and check the signatures and things for you just to make sure that that's not going to be an issue. But it's kind of like a black art, this kind of thing. And I've done so many of them that I kind of intuitively know what to look for, but it's not easy, which I suppose is good for me because it keeps me busy. All right, so the number one Stack Overflow problem is basically this. I have a legacy SAML application, and we don't want to change it because it works, because it might be millions of lines of code, but it's old, and we want to use it in the new world. And the new world is REST and Web API and all this whizzy stuff. So on the SAML side, I've got a SAML token, and on the Web API side, I need a JOT, and I need to convert them, right? And so it's very easy to write a bit of code to decode the XML and build up the JSON, but the big problem is you can't sign it, because the only person who can sign it is the IDP that issued it, because they're the only one that's got the private key. There is a profile, the SAML2 bearer assertion flow for OAuth, that actually addresses this problem. Unfortunately, I don't know many IDPs that address it. I do know that Azure AD is looking at it and will probably be out sometime first quarter next year. But that is a very big problem that no one I have seen has got a solution to, because they don't want to throw away the application. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of code, but they do want to modernize it. Okay, so we're getting to the end of my story. These are the references. So those are the SAML specs. If you printed them all out, you'd get a stack of paper, I'm guessing about 4 inches high. So some good bedtime reading. There's some stuff at the bottom. There's Wikipedia. There's a little guide that says there's so much in SAML. This is kind of like a learning guide. And then these are the links to my blog, because I wrote these articles because there was nothing else out there. In fact, I was looking at Stack Overflow this morning, and someone actually, that SAML stack one, someone actually gave it as a reference because someone had asked that question about, my boss says I have to have a SAML stack and I need it now. So thanks for listening. I hope you found it interesting and that you learned something. And I'm now going to pass back to Ado, and we'll see if there's any questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that presentation, Rory. And there definitely will be some questions. And if you guys do have any, please feel free to post them now, and I will read them aloud. And then, as far as I already saw a couple of questions regarding if the slides will be available and the recording. So the recording will be sent to all attendees tomorrow, or anybody that registered. And I will also include as many of the links that Rory has shared in his presentation in the email. And if he gives me permission to post the presentation as well, or if he has it hosted anywhere, I will be happy to send that out as well. And now when it comes to questions, let's see what we have. So the first question I have for you, Rory, is when would you use that IDP-initiated flow? Are there specific reasons you would ever, is there a good reason you would use that flow over just the traditional?
Yeah, so the main reason is where you have something like that app panel in Azure AD, where you don't want to give people URLs. You just show them buttons, and they can just click on the button, and they are already authenticated because they've logged in. And with Windows integrated Auth, it'll take them to the application. So if that button said Salesforce, it'll simply pass Salesforce the SAML auth response, and you don't have to worry about endpoints and things. The other thing that some people do is that button is actually in front of what I call a magic link, and some people don't want to use the app panel, but they have on their portal, they have, this is the HR system, and this is the expense claim system, and they are all software as a service systems, because people don't write these kind of things on their own anymore, and they use SAML as the federation protocol. And so there's a link on their company portal, and when you click that link, it is IDP initiated off to their software as a service ones. So it's just to make it, from a user, it's just a button or a link or something, instead of having to say, go to this URL and then go to the IDP and come back and so forth. So it's more a convenience thing. Also, some companies lock down things, so you have to do IDP initiated because you can't actually get to the application.
Got it. So you need to be authenticated before you can even see the application. So
yeah,
having that IDP initiated flow kind of allows you to do that. Oh, that makes sense. The next question that I have is, from your experience, do you have any cases relating to using SAML in healthcare? If you have any literature that you can share, or any personal experiences
using SAML in healthcare. Well, in New Zealand, we have some medical insurance companies, and we've got a company called Orion in New Zealand that writes healthcare software. So they connect up to all the medical insurance guys with SAML. But I don't have anything specific to healthcare rather than that.
Okay, cool. The next question I have is, so the metadata for a SAML response is sent via XML. Is it possible to send it in any other format like JSON, or is it?
No.
So it's only
No, it's not possible because, well, I mean, technically, yes, it is possible, but the SAML standard mandates that it's XML.
okay.
So if you sent it to like ADFS and there's a little button that says get the metadata from this URL, when it got the JSON, it would just say, I don't know what to do with this. So
Right.
yeah, the spec mandates that it's XML, but I suppose if you got both sides to agree that you could do it in JSON, there's no technical reason why it couldn't be done in JSON.
Okay, cool. The next question here is, are there any specific benefits to choosing SAML over OAuth and OIDC, or why let's see, let me try to, or why would companies, choose to use SAML over OAuth?
Okay, so I think the reason for that is that OpenID Connect OAuth is not a recognized federation protocol at the moment. There is one in draft, and I put the link up on one of those slides. When that comes out, and if it can do the same kind of federation, and I haven't really read the draft to great detail, then that would take away probably the number one reason. So, but again, that is for new implementations. There's a ton of legacy stuff out here. They all use SAML, and I do a lot of SAML. You kind of think about, like, there's an insurance company, well, there's an insurance product called Policy, which pretty much all the insurance companies in New Zealand use. That product is written in COBOL. Okay, and it's been around because it's such a big product. It's millions and millions of lines of code. No one's going to change it because it just works. So I think the SAML stuff that we've got at the moment is going to be the same. Yes, you can do it better ways, but if you've got 15 software as a service providers and they're all using SAML, you're not going to go and replace them all with OpenID Connect because you're not actually gaining any benefit. You're still getting the same functionality. But for new ones, if OpenID Connect started supporting that federation thing, then definitely yes.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And then the last question that I have here is, what are the use cases for signing or encrypting SAML requests?
That typically is done by security departments. So a lot of the IDPs, ADFS, for example, will only run on HTTPS, so it's already encrypted at the transport level. Some people like to have the tokens encrypted as well, because it's just another layer of encryption. And I can understand that from a security point of view, but what I can tell you is it makes it incredibly difficult to debug and try and get it working. So what I tell people is, let's turn not in production so much, but let's turn it off and get it working and then turn it on. The signing on the Auth0 request, for example, is simply to make sure that no one can leap in and send an Auth0 request from somewhere else because they can't sign it. So again, it's protecting against man in the middle and things like that. So it's very much a security feature. And the signing in SAML, again, it can get complicated. You can sign the whole token, or you can sign part of it, or you can sign only the insertions, things like that. There are different degrees of signature, but it typically is around security.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's it. And then would you say from your experience that most companies would, sign or encrypt their tokens or their SAML responses, or is it more, I guess that's kind of a question for me, but a follow-up.
Yeah, so definitely I think most companies want the request signed. I can think of maybe 2 or 3 that I've dealt with that insist on having them encrypted. So they would typically maybe be, you mentioned health products, so I think that would be a good case where, the information is personal medical information. So it kind of depends. If you're just going to Salesforce to do something and someone else managed to get that information, well, so what? They can see, oh, you did this, or you're a customer of that or something. But, medical information and banking information, financial information are kind of ones that you don't want to expose. So those ones would typically be ones that you probably encrypt.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And I do have another follow-up question regarding the SAML responses being encrypted. And let me read it here. So it says, if the SAML response claims are encrypted, is there a way to decrypt them for debugging? Can you recommend any tools for this? And I have the encryption certificate for the SP. So that
yes, if you have the private key, right, you can. There are, for example, component space has utilities that do that for you. So there's a command line program that you basically say, here's the certificate, here's the token, and it will de-encrypt it for you. I don't know of any online tools. There might be one, but the problem is if there's an online tool, that means you have to expose your private certificate online, and probably that's not a good idea.
makes sense.
Yeah, so no, there's definitely tools. I mean, I know component space because I've used it extensively. It is a commercial product; you have to pay for it, but yeah, it's got the IDP, it's got the SP, but it also has a whole range of utilities that do all this kind of thing for you. But yeah, it is a pain for debugging to try and decrypt the stuff.
Cool. And I do not see any additional questions coming in. Let's see. Yes, I think that's all we have for questions at the moment. I do want to thank you again, Rory, for giving us this really great introduction to SAML and how it works, and the demo as well. And yeah, one of the most common questions is if you would be able to share these slides with the resources so that
Yeah, sure.
additional.
I'll send you the deck.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and I guess with that said, we will call it a meetup. And thank you guys so much for joining. Again, thank you, Rory, for being our guest speaker this month. And we are looking forward to next month, where we don't have a topic defined yet, but we will make the announcement on the meetup page as soon as we do. Thank you guys, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
No, they all disappeared now. God,